Shalom, this is Rabbi Yossi Liebowitz, and I'm putting together a presentation on Judaism on behalf of the Public Library of Spartanburg. I'm glad to be with you. The word rabbi is a proper noun, which means for many a teacher. In fact, there is much that a rabbi does that involves teaching. However, the word actually means a master of tradition. For this reason, the word rabbi is sometimes misused by many people. Many years ago, there was a football player whose father was Jewish, though his mother was not, and traditionally speaking, he was not Jewish, but his teammates referred to him as rabbi. Many years ago, when I was a chaplain at the prison system in New York State, Dannemora, they used to refer to a policeman who was the helper of an inmate as their rabbi. But as a rabbi, I'm delighted to teach about Jewish tradition to you and to understand this very old and ancient faith. One way of understanding Judaism is to see it as a three-legged stool. The idea that the first leg represents God or divinity. The second is Torah, which, as we'll explain, has many views, that of tradition, or simply the 5 books of Moses. The last particular sense of this Jewish stool is a leg that refers to that of Israel. And Israel can be the ancient state of Israel, the modern state, or the collective idea that the Jewish peoplehood are represented by the name Israel. And so let me begin this presentation for the Public Library of Spartanburg by first talking about divinity. In the Jewish tradition, we favor the idea of a transcendental divine. That is to say, God is ultimately unknowable. Many traditions will favor the view of God as more knowable, sometimes even anthropomorphic, using human description to understand what the divine is all about. Judaism does not do that. I can illustrate this best by talking about how a young man was drawing a picture and his mother said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm making a picture of God," I guess his own miniature Sistine Chapel. And in the ceiling, he was going to portray God with a beard and the like. And the mother Jewishly said, "No one knows what God looks like." And of course the young boy said, "Well, they will when I'm done with my picture." Well, Judaism would argue that you really can't capture the view of the divine. Not possible. You can't understand God, who is ultimately transcendental and not knowable. Nevertheless, we try to apprehend the divine in all sorts of ways. There are many ways of referring to God in the Jewish tradition. One of the premier ways is talking about God from the Hebrew Bible, Elohim, the idea that God is expansive, a plural proper noun to describe God as all-enveloping and ever-present. Another name derives from the beautiful story of Moses at the burning bush, in which he questions the divine, "What name shall I use? What shall I say to Pharaoh, who has sent me?" And the bush responds, either through an angel or through his own voice, and says, "Tell them that I am, that I will be what I will be." He invokes a 4-letter name of God that scholars refer to as the Tetragrammaton. And it means not only is God everywhere, but God is every when. He is beyond space and beyond time. Well, the Jewish tradition then will understand that God again is unknowable, but we seek to understand the God of our fathers and of our mothers. Another name for the divine is the idea that the Jewish tradition will invoke the deity through other names, some of them quite affectionate. One of those names is a feminine proper noun, as in Spanish, which has masculine and feminine nouns. So Judaism also, Hebrew, has a feminine noun, Shekhinah, which means the divine presence. It is an experience of the divine sometimes revelatory, sometimes a mystical notion that when you're in study or there are coincidences that you trace to divinity. One of their names for God is simply El Shaddai, God the Master. One of the favorite names of God is to refer to God as Hashem, the name, again, hearkening back to the four-letter name of God, which Christians, again, have sometimes called Jehovah, and some other scholars have referred to as Yahweh. Well, you can have it my way or Yahweh. We have no way of knowing exactly how to pronounce that ancient name of the divine. One of the favored traditional names of the divine, which I prefer, is from the mystical heritage Kabbalah. Ancient is without definition. God is endlessly unknowable. Beyond, as the prayer book would have it, our descriptions, our adorations, any poetry or images that we could possibly try to invoke. Lastly, I would say that the Jewish tradition favors many, many other ways of referring to the divine. There's a beautiful poem called Yedid Nefesh, in which God is called a friend, a dear friend that all of us can rely upon and draw intimacy and encouragement and inspiration. So this is the first leg of the Jewish stool, which we call divinity or God. Moving on to the second name of the second stool, we call Torah, which very simply in one context means the 5 books of Moses, from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus to Numbers to Deuteronomy. In the Jewish tradition, we also refer to it as Torah, which means instruction or even enlightenment. Torah, in a wider way of viewing it, will also refer to tradition in general. The Jewish tradition has a name for our Hebrew Bible, which is called Mikra, not unrelated to the Muslim word Quran, which is the Muslim Bible. Many Jews, in fact many Christians, mistakenly think that Jews have the Old Testament. We do not have the Old Testament. We have the Hebrew Bible, which in translation to English is very, very similar, but it differs in language as well as in order. It is a different work entirely. One of the things to note, for example, is that in the Christian rendition of the Hebrew Bible, called the Old Testament, the book of Ruth appears right next to the book of Judges in the Old Testament, because it simply begins with the words that happened at the time of the Judges. The Jewish tradition decided to put that book, the book of Ruth, towards the end in a work called the Writings, which followed the prophets, which indeed had followed the first 5 books of Moses, properly called the Torah. Another distinction to be drawn, and there are many others, is that the Christian Bible, the Old Testament, will end with Malachi, who predicts that Elijah, the prophet, will return and will be the herald of the Messiah. This, of course, is the Christian understanding of Messianism in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. Jewish tradition, with all regard and respect, does not favor that particular interpretation. We look forward to a messianic time and the idea that universal peace and prosperity and justice will prevail. At any rate, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, also called Tanakh, referring to the 3 different sections of the Hebrew Bible, will end with a promise that the kingship of David, one of his descendants, will once again rule over Israel, and in the messianic hope that someday the ingathering of the exiles will occur. The other parts of the Jewish tradition include the fact that we are not merely, as it has been misunderstood, half Christians as we have the Old Testament, which we now understand is the Hebrew Bible. We have another work which is called the Mishnah. It is a work which complements and amplifies the meaning of the 5 books of Moses. So, for example, there are stories and there are lessons in this work which, accompanied by another commentary called Gemara, constitute an enormous encyclopedia called the Talmud. How can I best describe how Talmud works and how Jewish tradition then examines our heritage? One of the rules in the book of Exodus is that if a cow or some animal from your farm wanders into your farm, you're supposed to return the animal by the end of the day, by sunset. But the question occurs, what if you can't find the owner? What are you supposed to do? These are questions that appear in the Mishnah, this follow-up to the 5 books of Moses. Shall you advertise in the local marketplace on Monday and Thursday? Shall you do it for a week? Will you do it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks? Say, for example, you post flyers all over ancient Judea, and nobody claims the cow, the milk cow, who we shall call Betsy. Well, you milk her, you take care of her, and one night she has fallen in love with your prize bull, who we call Norman. Well, nature follows nature, and Betsy, our cow, becomes remarkably pregnant, and the gestation period, so we understand, is some 10 months for a cow, and little Sydney arrives. It's at this point that the original owner shows up, and he says, "My dear Betsy, where have you been? I've been in Europe on tour. I want my cow back." Well, of course, you want to return because fair is fair. The cow does belong to the original owner. But the one who found the cow says, I've been feeding her for at least a year. I've been paying veterinary bills. And not only that, I have a nuclear moo cow family. I can't separate the calf and the husband, the bull, from Betsy. So I want you to, fair is fair, buy the bull, buy the calf. And the original owner says, that sounds reasonable, but I have to tell you that you've been milking Betsy for well over a year and making quite a fortune from her milk. So I'm going to subtract what it is you made from the asking price. These are questions that are not resolved in the 5 books of Moses, but do find explanation and amplification in the work that we call the Mishnah, the Oral Torah. And on top of that, there are further questions that arise. What if Alexis rolls into your backyard? A modern rabbi would say, Moses never met Alexis, but he would research and find the story about Betsy and Norman and Sydney and see if those rules could somehow assist in understanding how to adjudicate this newfound situation. Another story, which always is my favorite, that has to do with understanding the Jewish mindset of always asking ever new questions. Story is about a farmer who wants to learn about Talmud, this encyclopedia of Jewish lore and law. Well, he goes to a rabbi who's not particularly predisposed to helping him out. He says, "You're an ignorant farmer, and I have to tell you, there's no use in studying the Talmud." The farmer pleads, "Please, let me please study with you. I want to be your student." The rabbi says, "Okay, I'll give you a little quiz, and if you pass the quiz, by all means, you can become my student." Well, the farmer says, "That sounds like a fair deal." And so the rabbi says, "I'm going to tell you about a mansion with a very wide chimney and a fireplace below. And there are 2 robbers that are in the middle of the night, a very dark night, no moonlight, are going to rob the mansion by crawling down the chimney. We call them Frick and Frack. Well, they crawl down the chimney," says the rabbi to the farmer, "and as they emerge, one of them has soot, blackened soot all over his face, while the other does not." And so the rabbi says to the farmer, "Who is it? Who is it that will wash his face?" The farmer simply responds, "Of course, the one with soot on his face is going to wash up." "Ah," said the rabbi to the farmer, "I told you you were not smart enough to learn Talmud. You see, the one who has a very darkened, sooty face looks at his partner with a clean face and assumes that his face is clean. But the one with a clean face seeing his partner with a dirty face, a sooted face, will think that his is dirty, and he will go to wash. Aha, says the farmer, I now understand Talmud. You do not understand it, says the rabbi, because if you understood Talmud, you would ask other questions, like, how is it possible for two people to go down a chimney and only one of them to get soot on their face? Aha, says the farmer, I now get Talmud. You still don't get Talmud, says the rabbi. If it was pitch black, how could they even see each other's face? And in addition, how is it possible? How is it ever possible with a robbing a house by stealth at night to go and take time out to take a bath? Every question in the Jewish tradition leads to another question, and in turn to further questions. So it is the world of Talmud, a vast sea of knowledge with stories such as these, laws that address every part of life to amplify the meaning of the divine in our lives. Now, the Jewish tradition does distinguish itself from the Christian tradition, which has the notion, and we respect all traditions, that we are born in a state of sin. I'm presently in the state of South Carolina, which can be understood to be a sinful state on occasion, but probably not. So, what does Judaism believe? It believes that we have competing impulses. One is called the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, representing our appetites such as aggression or sexuality or hunger and so forth, while another tendency or another impulse is called the Yetzer Tov, the good impulse, the kind of impulse that drives you to help the little old lady who's crossing the street with a bundle of packages, that makes us most human. And both of these particular impulses compete. But the Jewish tradition gives a stamp of approval to the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, because when its impulses are properly channeled, whether it is the sexual impulse or the aggressive impulse, you can have good things happen. You can take your aggressions and you can take your sexual impulses, create marriage or sports games or such and such ideas to make possible taking our Dr. Jekyll and our Mr. Hyde to form together into one full human being. So it is that the Jewish tradition understands the nature of humanity. Another aspect is that Judaism promotes the idea that we have many, many commandments. We are, of course, aware, thanks to Cecil B. DeMille, of the top 10 commandments. But in addition to those, there are 603. Of the 613 commandments, 248 are thou shalt, the positive ones, like you will give charity, you will pray, you will not put a stumbling block, you will treat the blind with compassion. And then you have negative ones, some 365, like the days of the year, which we call the thou shalt nots. You shall not make fun of the deaf. You shall not murder. You shall not do things which are abhorrent. When you put all these together, you have a covenant that the Jewish people have held sacred for over 3 millennia, trying to live a life that the Torah, whether it's the 5 books of Moses or the more expansive way of referring to Jewish tradition, as the most effective way of living our lives, a compass for our lives to get direction. So this is the view of the second leg of the Jewish stool. Many other traditions, of course, will abide. There are holidays to be followed. There are traditions that need to be accessed and to be appreciated. Prayer is a very major aspect of Judaism, 3 prayer services a day. The Hebrew word for prayer is lehipalel, which means to stand in judgment of yourself. Now there are, of course, what are called bakashot, requests, which are perhaps the most familiar way that we think about prayer, but the majority of Jewish tradition is about praising the divine to dwarf our ego, to know that we are not that important, and to say what it is that God has given us. So when we rise up in the morning, there's a prayer. The first thing we do is we open our eyes and we say, "Thank you, God, for you open the eyes of the blind." There are many people who don't have good eyesight. Many years ago, I had a president of my congregation who had a detached retina, and he got to see only half of the world, and when it was reattached, that prayer in the morning had more meaning than ever before. And then when you rise from your bed, you say, "Thank you, O Lord, for you guide the feet of the lame." You put your hat on, you say, "I'm crowned with glory." There are all sorts of prayers in which you, as a Christian minister might put it, you're able to count your blessings. And so there are other traditions about how we should eat, how we should live. Many of you may have heard the word kosher, meaning fit. It can refer to a prayer shawl with all the commandments represented by little strings called tzitzit, or it can refer to the many kinds of dietary rules. For example, there are forbidden foods. For example, bacon, which comes from a pig, which has maybe cloven hoods, but does not in any way chew its cud. There are shellfishes that are not kosher, and kinds of fishes that do not scale. One of the more important Jewish traditions is not mixing meat and milk together. In ancient times, they would slaughter a little calf for its very, very tender veal, and then take the milk that was supposed to help the calf thrive and grow, and would make a stew. Meat represented death, but milk represented life, and it seemed cruel to put those two together into a stew. So it is with these traditions of kashrut. We try to humanize our experiences when we eat. We not only thank God for the many kinds of foods that we have, but we do so with a sense of appreciation for life. The slaughter has to be done as mercifully as possible, and the blood, which is the life force, has got to be drained from the animal. So this constitutes the second of the three-legged stool of Judaism. We have again God, we have Torah, and now we have a third stool, which we call Israel. Israel was the name of the grandson of Abraham, chronicled to be the first person to realize there was one divine entity, one God. Jacob is a wonderful story. It's actually a novella in the book of Genesis. He was the fraternal twin of his older brother Esau. He was a bit of a trickster. He tried to deceive his brother. Not a very nice guy in the beginning. He dressed up like his brother, putting matted hair on his arm, and then fooling his blind father Isaac into giving him the blessing that his older brother merited instead of him. He flees, he goes to live with his uncle Laban, and learns that Uncle Laban is just like him, with around 20 years more experience. He marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and their concubines, and has a number of children which become the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. But on the way there, he has a vision of angels ascending and descending, some kind of what's called in the Bible a sulam. It's a rather curious word because it appears just once in the Hebrew Bible. Some translate it as a ladder, as in Jacob's ladder. Others think of it as an ancient ziggurat, this kind of tower that was very architecturally inviting. Others think it may have been something like an escalator, or if they had TV in those days, they'd call it a Star Trek transporter. All we know is that there were angels that ascended and angels that descended. And on the way back to make peace with his brother, Jacob encounters another divine agent, an angel, and they get into a wrestling match. And he is wounded in the process, but not before he begs and pleads and insists that the angel bless him. And the angel gives him a blessing, which is You are now known as Israel, for you have striven, you have wrestled with God and with man, and you have prevailed. And so it is the Jewish tradition has the name Israel, referring to the idea that it is perfectly fine, and in fact, it is expected to wrestle with one another, trying to find out the best way of living life in our way. It is not an easy religion for this reason, but it is a religion that is quite inspiring and that has been a boon to mankind for many, many centuries. I know I'm being a little bit boastful when I tell you that though we number less than 1% of the world's population, we certainly do feel great about all our accomplishments. Less than 1% claiming at least 15 to 20% of Nobel Prizes in literature, in science, in all sorts of arenas of life. And one of the reasons is that Judaism has always emphasized education. V'shinantam livanecha, you shall teach your children. And these words are literally put on a little box called a mezuzah, which we attach to our homes, our doorways. They're also part of our prayer system. There are little boxes called phylacteries with straps, and in them are the words from Deuteronomy, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your being. These are the great traditions of the Jewish people. And now we turn our attention to the last of the three legs of the Jewish stool, which we might call the leg representing Israel itself. Israel refers to the ancient state that existed over 2,700 years ago, which alas was vanquished by the Assyrians, a great disaster for the Jewish people. And then there was a southern kingdom, Judah, in the south, which persisted for a number of centuries until the Babylonians, the next empire, rose and then exiled the Jewish people for nearly 3 generations. The Jewish people returned, and again we were exiled once more during the Roman Empire. But it's important to know, as a song from the great Passover holiday Seder would have it, like Chad Gadya, all these empires rose and they fell, but the Jewish people persisted throughout time. And we pray will continue to be a beacon of hope for ourselves and for all people. So the Jewish people had an ancient Israel, and now we have a modern Israel. It is not possible to understand the importance of Israel to the Jewish people. At one point, there were nearly 18 million Jews in the world, and because of the horror of the Holocaust, which we call the Shoah, at least 1/3, 6 million Jews were annihilated, 2 million of whom were children. And so the idea of resurrection, of the rebirth of the Jewish people, is ever pivotal in our minds. The idea of Israel coming back to life. We have messianic hopes. We understand that someday the ingathering of the exiles will happen, but it will be a universal deliverance, not only for us, but for all children of Adam. It'll be a time of universal peace, prosperity, and we pray of justice. There are many, many other traditions that we like to share at this time. Lots of traditions that help us live lives that are moral. There are many heroes in our Jewish tradition, both male and female. One of my heroines is actually a woman named Golda Meir, who was a great stateswoman and had much to offer the Jewish people. She ruled and guided the Jewish people during some wars and was a remarkable woman. At this time of the virus, we're mindful, of course, of the search for a vaccine. And one of my personal heroes was a gentleman by the name of Jonas Salk, who invented the vaccine. They had tried many, many times to create one for this horrible disease that afflicted so many people, including a president of the United States. but it was he who succeeded. And Salk was asked, would you make money, patent it? And he said something to the effect, this was God's nature. How can I make money off of God? Well, could you imagine big pharma saying something like that in these days, in a market-driven economy? This is one of the great heroes of the Jewish people. I also favor the story of Albert Einstein, who distinguished himself through his scientific searchings for the secrets of the universe, updating Newton with his theories of relativity. All the peoples all over the world have many, many people who have made human beings mature and to grow and help all of humanity. And so this is our tale of the Jewish people, the three-legged stool of God, of Torah, and Israel. And the future of the Jewish people is before us, and it is ever tied, linked to the betterment of humankind. I thank you one and all for listening and wish everybody a beautiful spring, and the prayer that someday all of us will recover from this terrible affliction that has so devastated our nation and so many peoples around the world. So what do we conclude? We conclude with citing the national anthem of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel, the word hatikvah, hope. We live with tikvah, with hope in our hearts, for the dream of the Jewish people and for the dreams of all humanity everywhere. Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you. Only good things for you and your loved ones. Thank you so much for listening.